Please forgive me if I stutter, hesitate, or mispronounce anything, and for any noises in the background while reading this work. This is Chapter 6, Part 3 of Passerine. Same trigger warnings apply from the last ones. Wilbur fell back against the cave wall, staring at the space where Techno had just been moments before. He was familiar with the side of his old tutor, so easily startled in the moments of vulnerability, like a newborn fawn just starting to learn about the world capable of hurting it. My life was fulfilled the day I met you and Tommy. He sounded so sure as he said it. Wilbur wished he could say anything with even the fraction of conviction Techno had. It must feel so light, knowing your story's ending, but Wilbur could still spend 1,000 years wondering, and he would still feel like he was running out of time. A boy king first, and then just a king, and now a brother far from home. Who would he be the day he died? Would he meet death clumsily, slipping it into its arms at the age of 80, with his crown askew and his legacy secured? Or would it have to drag him, kicking and screaming, into the dark, frigid water filling his lungs, praying, "Father, Father, save me," with no one to remember him but two gods in a kingdom without a king? He did not know how he would face it if he returned. Would they understand what he did in the Blue Valley? Would they know it was for all of them? Would they care? King or pariah, there was only one other man who knew what it meant to be both. Would you have done it? Wilbur asked, once again a little boy looking for approval in the places he would never find it. Would you have buried them all in rubble? His father stared at him from across the flames, his blue eyes, Tommy's eyes, sparkling in the dim light. To save you, to save our kingdom. He shook his head, a conclusion reached. It is a sign of your goodness that you hesitated. I would not have spared a single thought to it. And how did you know I hesitated? Because I like to think I still know my own son. Well, maybe I'm more your son than you think, Wilbur said, because I didn't hesitate at all. The voices chuckled. Little Killer King, you've finally grown into your role. For a moment his father only stared at him. Then he said, "I'm sorry." Wilbur blinked. "What?" "I'm sorry," his father repeated, his voice cracking like the ice hiding tumultuous waters beneath. "I'm sorry you had to carry that. I'm sorry I was late. If I had been there with you, I would have pressed that button, just so you didn't have to." Wilbur felt his chest tighten, like some curious giant was squeezing him between his palms, breaking him open and asking, "What are you made of, little one?" "It wasn't a button," Wilbur said. "I blew a horn." "Did you know?" the voices murmured. Father looked just as surprised as Wilbur felt. "Right, I don't know why." He shook his head as if trying to clear it of cobwebs. "Will, do you sometimes feel like you're an echo of something, and not a sound of my own?" Wilbur chuckled darkly. "Every goodness darn day of my life." "For what it's worth," his father said, "I am proud of you, Wilbur, proud of who you were and who you are now. That will never be a question." "Thank you," Wilbur replied softly, and he meant it. "I spent your childhood so clouded by worry." The words rang true in the cave, in Wilbur's heart. "So afraid, always, that you would be taken from me. I had seen what the world was capable of. And when you began speaking of voices, calling to you, sometimes I could not even look at you without being absolutely paralyzed by fear." "And how do I look at you, Will?" Father had once asked. He dismissed the question before, insistent that it was disappointment that wrinkled his father's brow and tugged his lips into a frown. Now Wilbur thought he might be closer to the truth. His father had never been sad because of him. He'd been sad for him. It was as if Wilbur had been looking through a fog in his childhood, and now it is lifted, leaving only clarity. "But that was my own fault," Father continued, his eyes shining with tears. Wilbur noted with shock. It was a strange thing, watching your parent cry. Everything was backwards, and yet everything was just right. "If I ever made you feel inadequate, or unwanted, or like you disappointed me, Will, I want you to know you could never do that. I have lived this life for more time than you can comprehend. I have built empires and kingdoms. I have been a warrior, a ruler, a wanderer, an architect. But the greatest title I have ever had the honor of owning was a father." He smiled, even as his tears glistened down his cheeks, or as Tommy used to call me, Dad. "I miss him. The words broke free, tripping over themselves in release. Wilbur felt his own eyes growing misty, turning the world into a hazy blur of firelight. Miles and miles away from here, bundled in hay and their family's colors, their brother's body was heading home, but the rest of him lingered, even in the bleak panic of drowning and freezing. He had been there, telling Wilbur to swim, and when his voice retreated, in its wake had been the immeasurable sadness. But even then, the sadness was good, as good as Tommy himself had been. It was proof that once, love used to grow in the hollow cavern of Wilbur's chest. "I miss him so much, Father." In the dark, the god they called the Angel of Death said, "I know, Wilbur, as do I." When the blood god returned with his cheeks aglow and a pack full of fresh fish hunted from a king-sized hole in the ice, he found a father and a son speaking fondly of times long gone, their laughter soft and their faces bright. For once, there was more things to be said than not, and the moment of silence were a few and far between. They ate and drank and toasted to murmured names of dead and buried. They told stories as people used to tell stories of a mortal hunter and a hair-bringer of death. They spoke of gardens and forests, apple orchards, and a woman whose son inherited her hair and eyes and heart. But above all, they spoke of a thunderstorm bottled in a boy, the sun at the center of everything. And if there were any ghosts that haunted their reminiscence, they kept their silence. "We're almost there," Techno called out. "It's just over this hill." He looked back to find Wilbur slowly making his way up the slope, Philza hovering close behind, grimacing every time his son slipped or slid against the snow. Wilbur, in true Wilbur fashion, had decided he did not need any help, blaming his blunders entirely on his new fur-lined cloak and not on his inexperience with maneuvering a frozen incline. If he weren't so sure Wilbur would retaliate with an arrow to his shoulder, Techno would have laughed at him at his falling attempts. Techno leaned against his trident as he watched Wilbur swat away Philza's assistance. But, unlike before, there seemed to be no true heat behind the rejection, just Wilbur being Wilbur. Techno knew the fault lines between them could not be healed overnight, but he had to admit it was nice, having Wilbur not look at his father with a murderous intent every time. Ugh, Techno thought, when did I get so sentimental? If the voices had any comment, they kept it to themselves. In fact, they had been quiet the whole day. It wasn't unusual for Techno to go days or even weeks or months at some point without the voices murmuring like nosy neighbors in the back of his mind, but this felt different, sinister somehow. It felt like the smug silence of an opponent that knew it had the winning hand. "Gods, Wilbur," Techno called out, digging the butt of his trident deeper into the snow. "This entire tundra will have melted before you, before..." The rest of Techno's words trailed off as he felt his trident hit something too hard to be just snow. With a sinking feeling in his gut, Techno looked down at where his trident had stuck, somehow moving the snow aside with his weapon, slowly but surely unveiling what was hiding beneath his feet. "Techno?" Wilbur shouted, getting closer. "Techno, what are you doing?" "Gods," Techno whispered. "Gods and stars and shirt." Because beneath the snow was a pale face, staring unseen at Techno, its expression of wide-eyed terror forever preserved by the cold. His heart hammering in his chest, Techno ran until he crested the hill that overlooked what was once a bustling city but was now something else entirely. He could hear Wilbur scrambling up the hill behind him. He knew Wilbur would see it eventually, but still Techno turned back around, catching Wilbur by the shoulders before he could realize the full extent of the devastation. "Wilbur," Techno said solemnly, "I need you to know, this is not your fault." Wilbur's brows drew together. "I don't..." "Listen to me," Techno demanded, in a voice that he did not use on him since they were tutor and pupil. "We're here for one thing, and one thing only, and if anything can get in the way of that, your self-doubt, your fear, your loathing, I suggest you leave them at the door. Right here, right now. Do you understand?" Wilbur's eyes hardened. "I am not a child." "That wasn't my question." Wilbur shrugged, his hands on him gritted out. "I understand," before marching stoically up the rest of the way. "How bad is it?" Philza asked quietly as they watched Wilbur reach the crest. "Frickin' bad," was all Techno said in response. Techno could pinpoint the exact moment Wilbur saw it for himself. He went rigid, his hands curling into fists, the only indication that he was not a statue of a frozen flesh and bone. When Philza and Techno joined him at the summit, Techno heard his fellow god draw a breath as he, too, took in the massacre below them. Burned bodies lying in the scorched snow, frostbitten corpses laid in the careless pits that were tossed against the city walls. Bodies too small to belong to adults, blood scattered across the white landscape like some errant child had taken a red paintbrush to a black canvas. Dozens, hundreds, thousands, the entire city presented like a gruesome welcome sign. Without a sword, Wilbur slid down the rest of the way, his boots skidding against the ice and snow. Phil and Techno exchanged a brief glance before they followed after him, and the three of them made their way through the carnage, none of them speaking or even daring to breathe. Techno had seen his fair share of ruthlessness, but this cut to the bone like nothing else ever had. Perhaps it was the carefully blank look on Wilbur's face, or the way Phil tucked his wings close around himself, maybe remembering a different town, the first of the people he had sworn and failed to protect. Or perhaps it was because, somehow along the way, their people had become Techno's people as well. Not soldiers, not warriors, just people. It was until they were past the city gates that Wilbur's knees finally buckled, and he fell against a lamppost, retching. Phil was there immediately, rubbing soothing circles on Wilbur's back and whispering words too low for Techno to hear. He was too busy taking in the city. Despite the massacre of its citizens just outside its walls, the city remained immaculate, its cobblestone streets and brick houses untouched. Through an open door, Techno could see a room forever frozen in mundanity, a table laid with now spoiled food, and chairs pushed away from it as if the family it was meant for simply walked away from it, not knowing they would never return. In fact, there didn't seem to be any sort of disturbance within the city itself. No food carts overturned, no doors thrown off their hinges, no marks on the ground where people could have been dragged. What little snow stuck to the ground bore no signs of violent trespass, just evidence of that the entire city seemed to have willingly went to its slaughter. What in the world happened here? Techno thought, his hands tightening on his trident, almost snapping it in half. All of this, Wilbur said, staggering to Techno's side. All of this, just to get us here? Not us, said Philza, coming up behind him. Just me. I was getting close to something big, and the green god called me back. Techno let out a bitter bark of laughter. Philza, don't tell me we're supposed to reason with someone who would do this, just to invite you to a little playdate. We've done worse ourselves, Phil said quietly, making Wilbur freeze. To fighters, to enemies. You once fought for any cause that would give you an enemy, reminded Phil, his eyes pinning Techno in place. There was no accusation in them, just truth. That you would blanch now is proof of how far you've come. But in about a few minutes, Techno, I think we'll need your old heart. I know, Techno mumbled, turning away from Philza. Don't send a mortal for a god's work. Hey, Wilbur said weakly, I'm right here. And we're so glad to have you here with us, Techno said wearily. Could you say that again without looking constipated? Techno shook his head, unwilling to discuss it any further. Wilbur was not meant to be here. Techno had already lost a brother to this war, and wasn't too keen on losing another. But he knew there was no force on earth, mortal or immortal, that could stop Wilbur from standing under this pale red sky, running a finger over the pommel of the rapier seathed at his side with every intent to shove it through the heart of the god that killed his baby brother. In the distance, church bells began to ring. Philza met Techno's eyes. He's calling. Techno nodded, gripping his trident tighter. And we're answering. They moved as a unit through the dead city, no sound except for the howling of the wind and the insistent toll of the bells. The closer they got to the heart of the city, the more Techno felt like each footstep was not his own. There was a greater gravity pulling them forwards, giving them no choice but to descend. And then he came around a bend. He saw it, a bell tower rising towards the sky, its bells still pealing away, and beneath its long shadow, a church of marble and its doors thrown open, an invitation. It's not too late to turn back around, Techno said. Yes, Wilbur said, it is, and climbed the stairs to his apotheosis. What else could Techno do but follow? They walked into the church and found him immediately. He was sitting on a pulpit marble, his legs dangling over its gilded edge. He was calmly reading a book, eyes leisurely moving across the leather-bound pages. His eyes were the most striking thing about him, an unnatural shade of green that reminded Techno of overripe grapes, sour instead of sweet and rotten to the core. The rest of him was unremarkable, save for the fact that he was wearing nothing more than a faded white tunic and trousers in the freezing cold. He could have passed for a mortal. Curly dark blonde hair tucked behind his ears, hands wrapped in bandages up to his knuckles, and a face that could have been a face Techno passed on the street a million times over without remembering it. No obsidian wings or eyes the color of fresh-drawn blood. A man, not a god. Philza and Techno exchanged a glance. Is this really him? The quirk of Techno's eyebrows asked. I have no idea, Philza's shrug replied. Green God, Wilbur said loudly, stepping further into the church. We have come to demand. The man, the god, raised a finger to silence him, not taking his eyes off his book. Wilbur glanced back at Techno, his face in open disbelief. For a moment the three of them stood in a threshold, awkwardly shifting from foot to foot as the green-eyed being read on. Then, after a while, he took a deep breath, nodding to himself as he snapped the book closed and finally considered the three of them standing below him. And then he smiled. And there was no question about what he was. There was nothing kind in him. This was a god, through and through. Finally, he said, I was beginning to think you'd never show. Techno froze. No, it couldn't be. It wasn't possible. It wasn't. Out of the corner of his eye, Techno could see Wilbur, his mouth agape. He had never seen him so terrified. No, Techno whispered, or maybe he screamed. You too? Wilbur slowly nodded, unwilling, or maybe unable, to rip his wide-eyed gaze from the green god. Because the voice that came out of the green god's mouth, it was the voice, singular this time, and not a chorus, but still the same voice that had hounded Techno through the centuries, that had tied him irrevocably to a young prince and his forest fire brother. The voices, he and Wilbur had called them, but in truth had only ever been one, echoing over and over like words shouting into a chasm. A voice, the green god's voice. Surprise! The voice whispered in Techno's head as the green god said the same thing out loud. Surprise! What's going on? Phil demanded, his expression half worry, half confused. Techno? He's the voice, Phil, Techno whispered, his mouth feeling dry. All this time it was him. But how? Oh, that's a long story, the green god said with a chuckle, the same low, haunting laughter that had taunted and mocked Techno for as long as he could remember. But first, how are you? You must be weary after all that traveling, especially you, Wilbur. So sad to hear about your brother. Mortal hearts can only take so much hurt. He gave a casual shrug of his shoulders. Then again, immortal hearts aren't much different, especially if they've been foolishly given to the wrong people. Take the war god, for example. The angel of death merely drove a sword through his heart already broken. A flicker of darker emotion, nameless, fleeting, crossed the green god's face before his unnerving smile took center stage once more. Speaking of the angel, did you like my invitation, Philza? I spent such a long time drawing it up, but I figured you only deserve the best war, right? Who? Philza began with a measured fury. The frick are you? The green god considered them with the tilt of his head, blonde curls falling over glassy green eyes. They call me many names. You know me as the green god. Others brand me as the god of chaos, the progenitor, he who pulls, he who watches. All silly little names mortals give to something beyond their understanding. He placed the book he was reading on the ledge behind him and raised his arms over his head in a languid stretch. But my friends call me Dream. The red sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, fracturing over Wilbur's face, painted him in a kaleidoscope of colors as he stumbled over his words. Charming King Wilbur, for once rendered speechless, the green god, Dream, seemed to delight in his fumbling, his smile turning sharper as his gaze found Wilbur. Wilbur, Dream said, I truly commend you for that show with the explosions. You took most of them out in one fell swoop. But I have to admit, if Techno had continued on as he was going, I would have been forced to step in. I suppose I shouldn't have underestimated the great and powerful blood god. Wilbur shook his head slowly as if coming out of a daze. All those people, his voice trembled. Why? How? Those are two very different questions, Dream said cheerfully, so why don't we start from the very beginning?